Atheist Nomads episode 397, Satanic Panic.
The podcast you're about to listen to includes cursing and talking about hoo-haws. Please be advised.
Welcome to another episode of Atheist Nomads. I am Dustin, and it's just going to be me today. Don't forget, we've got the episode 400 live stream coming up on March 20, 2 o'clock Mountain Time. You're on the East Coast, and that would be 4 p.m. and 1 p.m. if you're in Pacific Time Zone. Of course, don't want to leave out Central Time Zone, which would be 3 p.m. And if you're in the rest of the world, well, whatever. So yeah, and that will be Mountain Daylight Time, so as to not confuse people in Arizona, since by that point we'll be an hour ahead of them. Man, time zones are just one of those crazy annoying things I'm going to go and just do a little rant with, because living in mountain time, it is crazy how much you end up getting with, like, you're working with people with other companies, including some in Arizona, who are screwing up how they're referring to time zones, and everybody is calling it always standard time, which, when you're in mountain time, there is the state of Arizona, which is always on Mountain Standard, and the rest of Mountain Time, and not all of Arizona, just some of Arizona, because some of the Indian reservations do follow Daylight Savings Time. And then you've got the rest of the time zone that does follow Daylight Savings Time. It's going to be Daylight Saving Time. And yeah, so you get that kind of stuff. And then there's all the talk about all these bills to go to permanent Daylight Saving or permanent standard, and yeah, it's stupid and ridiculous, and Daylight Saving Time needs to go away. And there have been bills in Idaho in recent years to try to go to permanent daylight saving, which would require federal sign-off through an act of Congress, because Idaho is in 2 time zones. The Panhandle is in Pacific Time. And if you look at the maps, almost all of Idaho should be in Pacific Time. And when you're already in the wrong time zone, if you go with permanent daylight saving time, then what that would mean in, winter solstice, the sun wouldn't rise until like 9:30 or 10 in the morning. When if you're at this latitude, we're only at like 43 degrees, almost 44 degrees. Yeah, it shouldn't be that late. It should be a lot closer to like 7:30, maybe 8 at the latest. So yeah, I really hope that doesn't ever happen, but we'll see. But yeah, the live stream, we will be on daylight saving time by then, because that's coming up in just on the 14th. So that'll be fun. Oh, and while I'm ranting about my pet peeves, the other one would be pennies and nickels, which if you look at the last time the US retired currency, it was the half penny in the 1870s, because it had been deemed to be not worth enough to be useful for commerce. And if you adjust for inflation, it would now be worth about 10 or 11 cents. So by that margin, we should be getting rid of the dime as well. But yeah, we should at least get rid of the penny, maybe the nickel. I would love to see daylight saving time go away as well. But yeah, we're still just trying to keep from losing basic human rights. So I guess those are pipe dreams for better days. So let's get to the Dustin off the degree. Moral panics are a thing that have been around for a very, very long time. If you look at history, there are records of in the 30s CE. So we're talking the year 30 to year 40. There was blood libel against Jews, accusing them of cannibalism, and that caused a lot of bloodshed. That ended up being a factor in the Jewish-Roman wars that went on from about the 30s on through to, I think, the 120s. And It was a moral panic about this weird group of people who in Rome had become about a third of the population, but they were weird. They did all their worshiping stuff on the wrong day, and they ate different foods. They didn't intermarry. They didn't worship the same gods. So they must be eating babies. And we're talking 2,000 years ago on that. There's clear evidence of that continuing on through the years with a lot of the anti-Semitic pogroms and the like, but also with the Inquisition and the witch hunts and the Salem witch trials and McCarthyism, where it is super easy for people to think the reason why things aren't going right is because it's this group that we can definitely identify as other, or you can just make up a group, identify people as being part of that group, make them the other, and everybody feels better about ridding the world of evil with the hopes that that will make everything better. If history shows us anything, that moral panic in Rome in the 30s CE resulted in some of the largest and most costliest wars the Roman Empire had ever needed to fight. It did not go well for them. It did not go well for anyone. It definitely went way worse for the Jews than it did for the Romans, but it was bad for everyone. If you look at the Inquisition and the witch hunts, it resulted in eventually about a third to a half of rural German women being killed. That's insane. And you look at the Salem witch trials, and that was just a small little grouping of that exact same thing. People died who hadn't done anything wrong, or at least not anything really wrong. And moral panics always end up failing. So when we got to 1980, there was a fascinating congruence of societal currents that created a perfect storm. You had some of the remnants of McCarthyism with the Cold War. You had the rise of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity and the moral majority, Jerry Falwell's group, who got kudos and the support of President Reagan. So you had that stuff going on one side. On the other hand, you had attempts to try to improve society by trying to get child abuse taken care of correctly. And by taken care of correctly, just taken care of. So mandatory reporting laws were getting passed, and child protective services departments were getting created. And social work was becoming a much more common and mainstream profession, working on trying to fix child abuse issues. Then you also have increased awareness of post-traumatic stress disorder as not just shell shock that affects soldiers, but a problem that anybody who's been through traumatic experiences might have. And dissociative identity disorder, which at the time was being called multiple personality disorder. And then there was Dr. Lawrence Padzer. He was a psychiatrist who had been treating Michelle Smith for what was then being identified as multiple personality disorder. And then they got married, and then they wrote a book together in a autobiographical narrative from her. The name of the book was Michelle Remembers, with details of recovered memories that she had recovered through the help of her then husband through the counseling of her being the victim of satanic ritual abuse as a child. Now, yes, to make sure this is clear, she was his patient, and then they got married, and then they wrote a book about him treating her. I know that is absolutely majorly unprofessional with potential risk of losing your license. I would hope it'd be enough to lose your license. Like, I'm sure the medical boards would not be happy with a doctor doing that now. But apparently that wasn't a big deal back then. So everybody jumped on these recovered memories. Then, once that book started to become more popular, it especially was popular with Oh, and Patzer was a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, so he got really popular in the fundamentalist Christian circles. And then social workers started picking up on it, and they were trying to get to the bottom of sex abuse and just child abuse. And so in their interviews with children, they started going with very leading questions that would get the response that they were wanting from these children. Then they would interrogate the adults that were getting accused of these fantasy accusations that the social worker had gotten the child to imagine and coerce a plea bargaining confession from the dad or daycare workers or teacher. And then, the daycares started getting pulled into it. With one, the McMartin preschool trial started in 1983, and it started with accusations in 1983. The arrests and pretrial investigation lasted from 1984 to 1987, and the trials continued through 1990. 7 years, and there were no convictions, and all charges were dropped. It made it the longest and the most expensive criminal case in American history, and there wasn't anything to it. The basic premise that had developed by that point was that there was because the other cultural current that was at play here was the Church of Satan, this public group of Satanists who never were public about how many members they had, but had all these high-profile members, so obviously there must be a lot of them. And so the basic premise of this conspiracy theory that was developing was that there was a satanic cult with millions of members in the United States that were kidnapping and abusing and sometimes eating children. Some of the versions of this got even more crazy and twisted than even just that. Like, that's the pretty sanitized version of some of the conspiracy theories at the time. And in a lot of ways, it just kind of seems like the modern QAnon movement, but if the main proponents were psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers. If QAnon had that kind of professional core, it would be way more damaging than it is now. And so the Satanic Panic continued. Psychiatrists were getting recovered memories from patients who they would often identify as multiple personality disorder, which again is now called dissociative identity disorder. But they would identify them as having these multiple personalities and determine that those extra personalities were caused by demons that they had picked up during ritual abuse, and they would write these detailed, elaborate stories. All of them wrote down, like all of the therapists involved and the social workers involved would all write down everything. And some of these were completely, definitively impossible, like identifying places that don't exist. A lot of them included rides in hot air balloons, where none of the people they identified had hot air balloons. One particular story involved a mentally handicapped man who was not able to drive, kidnapping this kid, and then took him in a hot air balloon after driving him away to get to this place where they killed a giraffe, rabbit, and elephant and drank their blood. Now, this is not a man who had access to a giraffe, elephant, or rabbit, or a car, or a hot air balloon. And there wasn't any evidence that any large mammals had been imported into that area or their bodies had been disposed of. Like, those are details that would be easy to corroborate if they were real. And a lot of these stories had details that would be verifiable. And in almost every single case, these stories were not able to be verified, where the only support for the accusation was the story by a child or the memories of a psychiatric patient, recovered memories from a psychiatric patient with details that could not be corroborated in any way. Now, there were some cases that actually were found. However, those few Upon closer examination, the people doing the abuse were not actually Satanists. They were definitely not part of any large organizations or any cultic practice that had been going on for thousands of years, kidnapping and abusing children. It was a few cases of people who were child abusers who got black robes and upside down crucifixes and pentagrams just to scare the kids and make them less likely to talk. So the few cases of satanic abuse that were found were not actually satanic abuse, and they were directly created by the Satanic Panic. And of course, the panic ended up expanding before it finally started dying in the 90s. It started expanding into rock music is of the devil, D&D is of the devil. There were kids that were... graffiti was starting to pop up with pentagrams and other satanic symbols, which, of course, when there's a moral panic around something, of course, teenagers are going to be trying to piss off or freak out the adults in their graffiti. And they just made it easy for that. I even heard some stories as a kid of a satanic cult in Juntura, Oregon, that drained cows of their blood in satanic rituals. Now, granted, the source that I heard this from was not reliable at all. And also, Juntura is a town of, at its peak, 60 people with no known satanic cult there. It is in a semi-arid area where when animals die, they dry up really quick. And you could easily say that, yeah, they were completely drained of their blood. No, they just died and dried up. That's what happens. Yeah, I only lived on the farm until I was 8, but I saw plenty of dead animals in that kind of condition. Well, and trips going back throughout the rest of my childhood and into my adult years, I also would see desiccated corpses. And in these cases, they are desiccated, not desecrated. And so this panic just kept going. And finally, it was really the McMartin preschool trial finally failing that got people starting to take another look at it and realize that almost none of the trials were successful, that they had enough. They were able to create a public panic, but they weren't able to convince juries that a crime had even happened, let alone that the person was guilty. In reviews and investigations into it, it was definitely determined that there was absolutely no satanic cult that was involved in abducting, raping, and killing children. That just didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. There was no satanic organization of any kind with millions of members. And what's crazy is, most of the trials failed to get convictions, but some did. A lot of the people who were falsely convicted were released later. Some are still in prison. Even people whose accusers have since recanted. And it was just a mass hysteria. And it wasn't just in the US. It spread to across the English-speaking world and much of Europe as well. As moral panics often do. And what's really sad with it is the people with dissociative identity disorder that these psychiatrists were treating were getting harmed by the psychiatrists who were leading them to these conclusions and not getting the care that they needed, since it was determined they needed exorcisms, not psychiatric treatment. That's really bad. And you had Child Protective Services departments that were getting distracted looking for a mass network of mass network of satanic child sexual abuse, and going after people who hadn't done anything wrong. They started probing daycare centers, regardless of whether or not there was any credible accusations. They got a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people were driven out of their communities. A lot of people were put through a lot of trouble because of this. And because they were wasting their efforts chasing boogeymen, they weren't tracking down actual child abusers. It also created the perfect social narrative for the right in particular to distrust social work as a profession. And it's taken social workers a long time to recover credibility from that. And it wasn't all social workers, but it was a lot. A lot of police departments got sucked into this and had training, often by pastors, on how to find and track down the satanic ritual abuse. And with the psychiatrists that were involved, one review of over 2,700 found that the majority of the claims of ritual abuse had come from just 16 of them. So it's clear that it wasn't all psychiatrists. It probably wasn't even most psychiatrists, but it was enough to do a lot of damage. And in some ways, the Satanic Panic still hasn't ended. In conservative Christian circles, even after satanic ritual abuse was no longer a credible concern, they kept the concern with rock music and D&D and moved on to video games and TV. I knew people in the Adventist church who became convinced that their TVs were an instrument of the devil and literally took axes to them. The panic continued with Harry Potter next, and it's still going on with the latest incarnation being QAnon, which is a conspiracy theory that believes that there is a Satan-worshipping cabal of high-ranking Democrats and Hollywood elite that are kidnapping, raping, and eating children. They are copying the Satanic Panic playbook almost exactly. The only place they're missing is they aren't bothering with the stories of supposed victims that could then be discredited as diabolical. So anyway, that's the Satanic Panic. So we previously talked about the Liberation Methodist Connection, which is the first group to split off from the United Methodist Church while not actually trying to split off churches and members from the United Methodist Church, so not even really actually a full split from the Methodist Church. The actual split that is being worked on, the schismatic group that is separating off, has chosen their name and logo. They will be called the Global Methodist Church, and their logo is a cross with 3 circles overlapping each other and all intersecting over the center of the cross. This is the committee leading this is working on a working draft of their planned denominations, governance, and doctrines to give something for the conferences and churches of the Methodist Church in 2022, since it's had to be postponed because of the pandemic, a chance to know what they're joining if they split from the main denomination. This is the conservative side of the Methodist Church that had voted to not allow gay priests or gay pastors, bishops, or same-sex marriage in Methodist churches. What is left of the United Methodist Church will be very quickly allowing those things. It is expected that most of the Methodist Church outside of the United States will probably be joining the conservative denomination, and that most of the white churches in the United States will stay in the more liberal or moderate denomination, which does include in the current working plan several years of financial assistance from the United Methodist Church to the Global Methodist Church, since all of the churches with the money are going to be staying in the liberal half. Which is not surprising. Now, none of this planning is anything official or final. After the split is finally agreed upon at the Minneapolis Convention Center, August 29 to September 6, 2022, churches will have the chance to decide which one to join, and then the Global Methodist Church will hold its first general conference where delegates will vote on the governance and doctrines and everything. And they're doing this because of the, quote, protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation, which is what the last United Methodist Church General Conference agreed upon when they decided that they would be splitting. Or it might have not even been the General Conference, it might have been a higher up level, or more of an administrative level. But reconciliation and grace through separation. Yes, that's called a divorce. It sounds like they're trying to make it amicable, and these plans that are being drawn up are amicable, or attempts at it being amicable, and then they will see if all of it gets approved next year. The Global Methodist Church planning team is saying that if the proposals don't get approved, and if the General Conference rejects the divorce, they'll be going their own way anyway. So really the only difference is that if this all gets passed, the transfer of property ownership for churches that go with the global church, the Global Methodist Church, and the money transfers will go through. And if it fails, that's all going to get ugly, just like a divorce. And as a general rule of thumb, I don't cover state legislative bills until they are at least passed by an entire house of a state legislature. And that is because, as is the cliche goes, the states are the test beds of democracy, and it's where all the bad ideas get proposed. And many of them, even if they make it through committee, never get voted on by one house, let alone taken up by the other. And if it's coming from a state House of Representatives, or whatever the lower house in a state is called, the greater the chances that if it passes something, it's going nowhere. But I have to make exceptions when it's Idaho. And a scholarship bill has passed committee and is going to the House floor. It is going to create, if it passes, will create the Strong Students Grant Program and the Strong Students Scholarship Program. The grant program, which is actually being modeled off of the governor's Strong Families, Strong Students program, which gives federal funds to low-income families to help cover education-related expenses, like helping kids buy backpacks and notebooks and pencils and the like. The Strong Students Grant Program would open that up to private school students, and then the Strong Students Scholarship Program would reallocate 90% of the money that the state spends per student in public schools to be given directly to parents to pay for private education. This would only apply to students who are enrolled in public school, but their parents are wanting to switch them to a private school. And they are expecting it to cost $5 million a year. And that's if only 800 students apply. What this really is a voucher program to siphon money away from public schools to give more money to Christian private schools. And I'm opposed to voucher programs on a myriad of reasons, starting with, I personally believe that private education is a disease and needs to be destroyed. Most private schools, and okay, sure, the prep schools on the Ivy League prep schools on the East Coast, I can't say anything about them because I don't really know anything about them other than they're probably fine. But the private schools in small towns around America run by churches are small. They do not get the benefits of economies of scale. They do not necessarily have to follow state standards, and they do not have the programs necessary to help kids who need help. In theory, they don't need to because they only get kids from, quote, good families, which usually means white upper class or upper middle class families, or with scholarships from within the church, members of their own church. And when you start taking money away from public schools to cover these programs, public schools can teach the average student for a lot less than the average cost of per student to teach them. And that is because of the economies of scale. And also because public schools have to teach all the kids that are a lot harder to teach. Private schools can not take students or can kick out students for any reason, including not performing well academically, like say a kid who might need special ed. Private schools don't have special ed programs, so they can't handle that. So they send those kids back to the public schools. Any kids that have too bad of behavioral issues, they'll expel them. And then the public schools have to take them. Any kids that are just too difficult, they can get rid of. By doing that, they're able to teach to a higher level because they're weeding out the poorer performing students, while the public school has to teach to the students they have. And if all of the best students are going off to private schools, then that's going to dumb down the public schools as the teachers are having to teach to a lower and lower average every year. And additionally, when you're taking off 90% of the average per student, then the students who need more spending, one example of a very expensive student would be my nephew, Zach, who has cerebral palsy and is in special ed and has an attendant just for him at school. It costs way more than $6,900 or it costs way more than $6,700 a year to school him. And there are a lot of kids in special ed classes and who have those extra needs that are way more expensive, and those kids have to be taught and have to be taken care of. And so when money's getting pulled out of the schools, they can't take money away from the special ed programs, so they have to take it from the general programs, which just drives more and more parents to wanting to get their kids into better schools because they're bankrupting the schools. It's an ugly, horrible cycle, even if you ignore the First Amendment issues. It is a very ugly cycle. And in Georgia, a new bill from a state House of Representatives freshman who's a Democrat would bring prayer back to public schools. The particular bill is weird. I'm just going to say that. It is really weird. It would be not adding anything to the day. There's already a moment of silence for up to 60 seconds before the Pledge of Allegiance, which is also mandatory every day. This bill allows students to stand up and offer an opening prayer in class. But not just any prayer. The bill includes the prayer that students will have the opportunity to choose to give in class, which is, we pray for all students, teachers, and staff who work here. We give you all the children who study here. We pray our school will be a safe place to learn great skills and talents. May this be a place where we love to learn and a place where we learn to love. A place where everyone is respected and all are deeply valued. Bless us to maintain good health and protect us from evil. We ask these blessings through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. That is a Christian prayer that is being endorsed by potentially will be endorsed by the Georgia State Legislature for children to voluntarily start doing in class. And if you don't think that's a bad idea, just imagine the kid who's the only atheist or Muslim or Jew in that class when everybody else all stands up and starts giving the atheist and Jewish and Muslim children to Jesus. Yeah, that's just bad. That's just bad. And since the Supreme Court keeps changing its mind and apparently has now, not changing its mind, since Amy Coney Barrett replaced Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court has definitely changed its mind on whether or not churches have to follow public health orders. Because in an unsigned opinion, the Supreme Court determined that 5 California churches that had sued Santa Clara County could hold indoor services, even though the county had decided that there could be no indoor gatherings. And what sucks with this is the exact wording of the order had nothing to do with whether or not you could enter a building or you could do things in a building. It just prohibited having any gatherings in the building, which would mean it allowed you to go to church to have a private mass with your priest or go to the confessional or meet with your pastor, but not to actually have a gathering, a mass gathering of people. Basically, just like a retail store or a bookstore, you can go to the store, but you can't have people gather around for a book signing. Now, so yeah, and the Supreme Court has decided that nope, they can't restrict whether or not churches can have gatherings. So apparently, as we've been tracking these rulings, churches can always hold gatherings during the pandemic. They can only be restricted on percentage of building occupancy and nothing else. And that's bullshit. Now, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the Southern Baptist Convention admonishing their religious liberty department because of being too liberal, and how they've had churches leave the convention over what they perceived as liberal shifts in the denomination. Well, I guess to make sure that it's completely clear where the Southern Baptist Convention stands, they are kicking out an entire church because the pastor allowed a gay couple to join. Townview Baptist Church in Kennesaw, Georgia. The controversy started when Jim Conrad and the leadership of the church decided to allow this couple to join. In response, a third of the congregation left, and now they're probably going to get kicked out of the denomination. So, yeah, the Baptist Church is definitely not getting more liberal. The Equality Act is working its way through Congress, and while it was being debated in the House, and the Equality Act will prohibit discrimination on... The Equality Act will bring sexual orientation and gender identity into the Civil Rights and Fair Housing Act, which would mean workplace and housing protections for the LGBTQ community at the federal level. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has already been stripped of committees, so she didn't get to talk about this in committee. She had to, but she did still get her views across, said, quote, "It has everything to do with attacking God and believers," end quote. She called the act disgusting, claimed that it attacks women's rights, claims that it will force Christians to approve abortions. Yeah, the kind of crazy that we'd expect of her. And Florida Representative Greg Stubbe from, who's a Republican, spoke during the floor debate on the Equality Act, saying, starting with a reading from the book of Deuteronomy, saying, quote, "A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this." Now, this verse isn't concerned about clothing styles, but with people determining their own sexual identities. It's not clothing or personal style that offends God, but rather the use of one's appearance to act out or take on a sexual identity different from the one biologically assigned by God at birth. In his wisdom, God intentionally made each individual uniquely either male or female, blah, 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 blah. He got some direct responses from Democrats in the House. Representative Al Green, Democrat from Texas, said, quote, You used God to enslave my foreparents. You used God to segregate me in schools. You used God to put me in the back of the bus. Have you no shame? End quote. Jerry Nadler, Democrat from New York, said, "What any religious tradition describes as God's will is of no concern of this Congress," which, yes. And while the bill has passed the House, it is not likely to pass in the Senate, but Republicans are already working on an alternative bill in the House, which you would think they'd be trying to get the alternative in the Senate. They're calling it the Fairness for All bill, and it was introduced by Chris Stewart, a Republican from Utah, with 20 co-sponsors. It would still ban discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation, but it would have exemptions for faith-based organizations. The Equality Act is being actively lobbied against by Orthodox Jewish synagogues, the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the National Association of Evangelicals. They are all in favor of what's being called, or what's modeled on the Utah Compromise, which is Utah's LGBTQ anti-discrimination law. Those religious groups are in favor of the Fairness for All compromise. Interestingly, the Southern Baptist Convention and U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops are expected to oppose both. Where the big difference would come in with these two is the reason for this push for a compromise is for colleges and universities run by Christian churches. If the Equality Act becomes law and these religious colleges and universities discriminate against students on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, then they would lose all access to federal funding, including Pell Grants and possibly even federal student loans. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has, I think it's 15 total colleges and universities in the U.S. The Mormon Church has quite a few, and there are hundreds of other Christian colleges and universities who do discriminate against students. Oh, and the Equality Act would also include in it the ability to use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 as a defense for discriminating against somebody. For example, in denying them a wedding cake. Possibly the compromise bill would not have that. I don't know that detail. I honestly hope the Equality Act is the one that passes and gets signed into law. Fortunately, both are a step in the right direction. One gets us a lot further than the other, but both are steps there, and both are an improvement over the status quo. And I honestly think, especially at the point that you have churches petitioning Congress and supporting the uses in one way or another of God's will to be discussed in the halls of Congress on the House floor in debate, I think we might need to reconsider whether or not religious schools should have access to federal financial aid. Because if they weren't, that wouldn't even be a concern in the first place. Adam Darski is a heavy metal musician in Poland who has been charged with blasphemy from a 2019 Facebook post that included a picture from before a concert where he stepped on a picture of the Virgin Mary. He was fined 3,340 euros, which is about 4,000 US dollars, and he appealed that ruling, so his case is going to be going to trial. He could potentially be facing 2 years in prison for that. So he's raising money for his legal defense as well as defense for anybody else who gets charged with blasphemy in Poland. He's already reached his goal, but more money would allow them to fight more cases. And there have been several that I know we've talked about on the podcast. So hopefully his case goes well and that he wins. All right. I don't have any feedback for this week. If you want to, the chat is definitely growing on Discord. So if you want to get in on that, you can find it at atheistnomads.com/Discord. If you want to send us a message, you can use the contact form on the website, or you can send us a email at feedback@atheistnomads.com. If you want to support the show, you can find out how at atheistnomads.com/donate. And until next week, remember, not all those who wander are lost.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Atheist Nomads. You can find show notes and contact information at atheistnomads.com. Follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/atheistnomads. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcatcher of choice, and while you're there, feel free to leave us a review. Theme music is courtesy of Sturdy Fred. Until next time, this has been the Atheist Nomads.